I call the honourable member Chris Hipkins.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. It's always a pleasure to follow Tau Henare after he's been speaking on a bill. He normally gives me so much material, but having listened to that, I got nothing, because he didn't make a single useful point that's worthy of any rebuttal in that 10 minutes. I sat there thinking, that's 10 minutes of my life I'm never going to get back. That's the only thing I could think when Tau Henare was speaking. Although, Mr Speaker, he did raise one or two things. He talked about the fact that when he was growing up, there were Cortinas. The cars that people could get when he was growing up were Cortinas. Well, he must be younger than he looks. That's all I can say, is he must be younger than he looks, because I'm pretty sure that there would have been much, much older cars on the road when Tau Henare was still growing up. In fact, I'm surprised they actually had motor cars back in those days. I'm surprised they had motor cars at all. He talked about populist issues as well. I thought that was kind of an interesting thing, an interesting itch for him to scratch, because actually I think the most populist issue in this bill, it's all coming to me now. The most populist issue in this bill is actually raising the age from 15 to 16, because there's no evidential base to doing that. The only thing that it can be about is about populism, because they haven't established an evidence base. Now, it's very contradictory, the government's position on the two contentious issues in this bill, the raising of the age and the lowering of the blood alcohol level. Because on the one hand, there is a very compelling evidential base to say that lowering the blood alcohol level for people driving will work. It will save lives, it will make our roads safer, and yet the government aren't going to do it. Clear evidence to suggest that it will work, and they won't do it. Raising the driving age from 15 to 16, very little evidence that can actually be nailed down and says this is going to work, this is going to make our roads safer, but the government are going to do it. Now, I suspect, I don't know what the polling numbers are for raising the driving age, although I suspect it would be pretty popular with most of the people who aren't in the age category that's going to be affected by it. But polls don't actually reflect whether or not it'll work. And in the case of raising the blood alcohol level, I wouldn't rely on an opinion poll for that. I'd rely on the evidence, and the overwhelming evidence suggests that it will work and it will make our roads safer, and there is no evidential base that increasing the driving age from 15 to 16 will make our roads safer. In fact, this bill doesn't just increase the driving age from 15 to 16, it effectively changes the system that we have so that before anyone will be able to get behind the wheel of a car independently, they'll be 17. They'll be 17 before they can drive by themselves. That's going to have a significant impact on a number of young people in New Zealand, particularly those who live in rural or isolated areas or in suburban areas where there isn't good public transport. It's going to impact on their ability to participate in sport. It's going to impact on their ability to participate in any kind of community or team-focused activities. And what will kids do when they can't do that stuff? Well, they're more likely to get into trouble. They're more likely to be out there tagging. They're more likely to be out there doing stuff that we don't want them to be doing, when actually, if they had a bit more freedom, they would actually keep out of trouble, and we wouldn't have other problems that we might have to deal with as a result of that. If there was an evidential base that suggested that raising the driving age from 15 to 16, effectively to 17, which is what this bill will do, I'd be open to that. But it hasn't been established. It hasn't yet been established. So overall, looking at the evidence that's been presented, there's no compelling case, because most of the crash statistics, for example, that New Zealand Transport Agency collects, they collect in the age band 15 to 19-year-olds. So it's difficult to actually look at the raw statistics and paint a picture that justifies the raising of the age. It's also not clear from the evidence whether the crashes that do happen in that 15 to 19-year-old age bracket are the result of a lack of experience, a lack of supervised driver training, or other factors, rather than the age itself. Are we simply delaying the accidents that will currently happen in that 15, 16, 17-year-old age bracket? Are we just delaying them by a year or 2 years, will the people, when they get their licence, still end up going through that same phase? And if that's the case, we haven't made the roads any safer at all. We've simply delayed it, and the cost of delaying it is that these young people who, and particularly those in rural and isolated areas, have lost the freedom that comes with being able to drive a car. Now, one point that Tauhinari did make, which I've already alluded to, was when he was talking about his Ford Cortina. I'm assuming his first car was a Ford Cortina. And fine, that's correct. We now have much more souped up cars on the road. Young people can get behind the wheel of much, much faster cars. That is a concern. But that's not to do with the age at which they can get their driver's licence. It's to do with the types of cars that we've got on the road and the modifications that people make to them, the lack of supervision around them. There's a cost factor in there as well. There's a whole lot of other issues that we would need to unpack and consider. But the age as itself is not the proxy for dealing with the issue of young people getting in trouble behind the wheels. I would say one of the things we could do actually is look at the structure of driver training in this country, because I think driver training in this country isn't good. It's quite weak. I think we could beef that up and strengthen that considerably. That's not to do with the age. That's simply to do with whether or not when somebody goes through driver training, learns to drive, they're actually taught to drive safely. And they're taught what to do in an unpredictable situation. And cars are very, very unpredictable. The roads are very unpredictable. Unfortunately, the way our driver training works in this country, the driver test is incredibly predictable. When I did my driver's licence, I went out with the driving instructor. When I went out with the driving instructor, the hour before I did my test, we drove the circuit that I was going to be tested on. So and there were some roadworks on there, for example. So by the time I actually got to do the test, I'd already been through the roadworks. The driving instructor reminded me that I need to do this, that, and the next thing when I went through the roadworks. I passed the test, no problem at all. There was nothing unpredictable about it, because I'd already just driven around that circuit. I knew exactly what the instructor, the tester, the testing officer, was going to ask me to do. So if we actually want young people, or even older drivers, when they're driving for the first time, to be tested on whether or not they can cope, we need to look very seriously at the training system that we've got in place and the testing system that we've got in place for our drivers. Actually, I'd also argue that some of the unsafest drivers on our roads are some of the people who have been driving for quite some time and have slipped into some quite bad habits. So and I think some of our most sensible drivers would actually be among some of the newest drivers who have just been through the theory tests and so on. They put both their hands on the steering wheel. I bet you not every member in this House, in fact I'd say the minority of members of this House, actually do drive with both their hands on the steering wheel. They don't have one resting on the gear lever or one resting on the armrest. Most of the young people, of course, they're so blooming paranoid about it because they've just been through it. They're so worried about it, they have both their hands on the steering wheel. They're probably actually safer drivers than many of the older people who have slipped into bad habits. So I think we could look a bit more about that if we want to deal with to make our roads safer, because I would argue quite clearly that an inexperienced 16, 17-year-old driver is just as likely to have a crash as an inexperienced 15-year-old driver. So increasing this by a year or 2 years, the bill effectively increases it by 2 years because of the changes it makes to the beginner licensing period. It's not going to change the problem. It's simply going to shift the problem from one age band to another. I want to just briefly return to the lower blood alcohol level that the Labour Party has been arguing for. The blood alcohol limit that we have now is dangerously high. And actually, if anything, this debate about it has simply highlighted to a number of people that they can drink more than they thought they could and still be allowed to drive. I think a lot of people now, anyone who's paid attention to this debate, didn't know that they could actually drink a heck of a lot more than they thought they could drink and still be legally allowed to drive. So this debate, unfortunately, could have simply been counterproductive. Could have actually let people know that they can drink more than they thought they could. I think people do drink and drive in this country and get away with it because they're legally within the limit, even though they are not fully in control and fully alert when they're behind the wheel of a vehicle. I think lowering the blood alcohol limit from 0.8 to 0.5, as has happened in so many other countries, as the evidence suggests we should be doing, would be one of the things the government should be doing in this legislation. They're not, and I think that's a wasted opportunity.